I tell it to put the resolution back where it was.
Oh my god, it's a little difficult. Let me see. On the top, you're going to see a menu, for example, adding people.
Cosplay photo I put in. There's a menu: chat, screen share, showcase, Q&A.
Let me show you. I'm going to share with you. Oh my god! Here you are. Can you see yourself here?
I'm seeing a tunnel effect.
Okay. See this one.
Turn camera on.
Did you hear? Yeah, you.
Adjust bandwidth usage. It's auto high density.
Yeah.
Adjust your video quality to limit your band. Oh, well, I want the video quality up. Learn more. Start a video call before you. Oh, good. No. What does this do? I think that's volume. No. How about this?
Oh, mine is Portuguese. I forgot this. Well, if you see here, you're going to see a microphone, a camera. You just click on the camera. Or, no, you have to click on activate it. Let me see if I can share the screen.
Turn the camera on. But, oh, it thinks that the camera is off. Are you seeing me?
No, I'm seeing a photo of yours. Now I'm seeing you.
Hello.
Good. Here we are.
You're still at very low resolution. I'm assuming that I'm grainy on that end.
Actually, because of YouTube. Oh, my.
Now you're a frozen photo. No, wait.
Yeah. My camera is better, but YouTube just reduced the resolution of my camera, and it's not so good on YouTube. I don't know why. Yeah, it's a little weird.
Well, if this is good enough for you, I am hearing myself echoing back through your speaker. That is impressive.
Oh my god. Let me check.
No, it's fine. It's not hugely distracting or anything, just...
Yeah.
And now you have a forehead, right?
Input. Let me see here. Can you still hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
And do you hear yourself through my phone?
Well, I can hear you. I have headphones I can put on at this end if it would help.
Okay.
Somewhere. Suspend that. And headphones. Tangled headphones. Very tangled headphones. I will probably get interrupted at about 2 my time.
Okay, not a problem.
So, don't know how much you wanted to. Let's try. Okay. How about now?
Better, much better.
That's the microphone jack. Okay.
Okay. So here we go. So I'm gonna have just a few questions for you. Okay.
Go for it.
Let me check. Do you want to see the questions?
Up to you. You're running the show, and I assume you're the one that has video editing software.
Yeah. So I see no. There are a few questions that you can ignore it. For example, you have been making an excellent offer. Of course, I mean, that's something I was going to tell you because I admire your work.
Thank you. I assume you're just like recording stuff and we'll splice it into something that sounds coherent at some point. We don't need to like have an intro or something, or?
Okay. Yeah, I'm going to record it on my smartphone.
Wait, you're recording video of the screencast on your phone. You can't record it here?
Yes, it's already recording here.
Oh, life is good. Okay. I don't know what I'm doing.
Just to prevent something goes wrong, I still have my audio here.
Woot.
Yeah. Okay, let me just. Oh my god. Okay. So here we go. First of all, I'm going to present myself. Then I'm going to present you. Okay.
Oh, you can't see the thumbs up unless I do them much higher.
Okay. And you can use your phrase that I like a lot. Hello world.
Hello world. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good phrase. Okay. So, well, here we go. Welcome, boys and girls, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to my YouTube channel. And I'm here today with the mastermind of Toybox. So, welcome, Rob Landley.
Hello world.
So, thank you for receiving my invitation, Robbie. Well, so here we go. Of course, I gotta thank you for all of the work you have done. For example, Toybox, Aboriginal Linux, and improving Android, and everything else you have done.
Glad you liked it.
And I'm sorry for disturbing because you're too busy and you're traveling, and here
it's
I
fine.
am. Okay, so thank you.
There's no need to apologize. It's good to talk to people who are also, I mean, we're all basically just getting out of the car, getting behind it, and pushing. So that's how we do the development.
Yeah, good. So here we go. Well, I don't know how to start at this point, but talking about Toybox,
Okay.
I have a question about it. For example, well, I know it's like BusyBox, but it's simpler and smaller.
Tries to be.
Yeah.
I'm not actually pushing too much about the smaller. I am pushing the simpler. BusyBox will often complicate itself in order to contort into small spaces. And a lot of the times, you know, I remember way back when they had config options for something like 5 different MD5 sum implementations that were slightly different trade-offs between speed and size or memory usage.
Mm-hmm.
And what I basically did is I did one simple one, and then the Android guys wanted to use the one out of something called libboring, which is a libSSL fork. But they wanted to use the one that has like weird architecture-specific assembly optimizations that I'm never doing. So I made it so my config option is use the simple built-in one that gives you, well, we'll go into that. Sorry, these are the kind of tangents that I really like there to be people with editing software to edit it out because I'm composing my thoughts. There's a big long tangent about one of the goals of Toybox is making us the simplest possible development environment that I need to apply to AOSP. But that's not really what the Android guys are interested in. They want something that works for them now and isn't a huge speed regression from what they're already using in like libSSL and stuff. So they want the ability to use that optimized code, and I want the ability to have a system with no external dependencies that you can read every line of and audit it all. And so those are the two I chose. Mm-hmm. You know, you can use the external version, but I have a built-in version that isn't really optimized. It's just so I can build with no external dependencies. That was a tangent.
Yeah. I like a lot of Toybox. I had to download the binary and the source code, compile it, test everything. I also checked the code and I liked it a lot. I could say something that people can use even to study and learn programming language.
Well, before you started recording, I was, asking you what your video recording software and stuff is, because one of the to-do items I've had for a long time is I want to make a bunch of little tutorial videos walking people through each command. The how to use it and how did I implement it, with an eye towards, other people should understand what I'm doing, so that the bus factor gets up, so that I'm not a bottleneck. You know, I want other people to inherit this so that at some point I can go on and do something else.
Yeah, I see. Yeah, good. Maybe I'm going to do something like this using Toybox. Actually, one of the questions I have, BusyBox is not used on the bootloader. Sorry, the boot process. It's used also as a terminal. For example, Alpine Linux doesn't use Bash. It uses BusyBox. Can we use Toybox as a terminal? A default terminal?
One of the commands that I need to write is a command shell. It's the program that when you type a line, it actually implements it, and it handles pipes and redirects and environment variable substitution and all that kind of stuff. And I have fairly high standards for what I want that one to do. So I haven't actually seriously started writing the shell yet, because it's going to eat my life for 6 months when I do.
Oh my god.
And I don't want to do it in little chunks. I actually want to get a good running start at it and do a lot of it at once, because you have to load an awful lot of context in your head for some of these commands. So I held off on doing sed for years, even though I'd already written BusyBox's sed. I hadn't cleanly started from an empty screen and written BusyBox's sed, but I'd incrementally replaced all the code that was there with a fresh implementation. So I couldn't just lift it out and use it like I could with some of the BusyBox commands that I wrote this from scratch. There are no external dependencies. I know what bits to trim off so that all this is my copyrighted material and I can do it under zero ClauseBSD.
I see.
And I did eventually write a sed because I understood that problem space very well. I'm still researching what I want for the command shell, in part because I want a proper bash replacement. One of my big complaints about the worst technical decision Ubuntu ever made was replacing their command shell with dash, which I refer to as the defective annoying shell. I know that's not what the acronym stands for, but where Linux came from is in 1991, Linus Torvalds wrote a terminal program in assembly because he was using an operating system called Minix that its interrupt handling was so terrible that it couldn't keep up with a 2400 baud modem without dropping characters. And then so he didn't have to keep rebooting into Minix. He taught it to read from and write to the Minix file system so he could download stuff. And then he taught it to run bash so that he could rename files, delete files, list what was available, that sort of thing, without rebooting into Minix. And that's how it evolved into the operating system that became Linux. So bash was the first program Linux ever ran. Bash was the only shell of Linux for something like 15 years, until Ubuntu suddenly went, no, 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 our init scripts are running too slowly. They actually have a web page explaining why they did this. Bin sh as dash. You can Google for Ubuntu bin sh as dash, where they said our init scripts are too slow. You know, the system takes too long to boot. But changing all the little # exclamation points at the start of each init script would be far too intrusive a change. So we're going to change where the bin sh symlink points to and break the kernel build. Thank you very much, Ubuntu. And then this didn't fix it. And afterwards they went, well, it's still too slow. We have to parallelize it now that we have SMP systems after 2005. So we're going to write Upstart. But they never admitted that their earlier changing the system shell to dash was a mistake, although they've made it so that every login shell is bash. The default login shell is bash, so that when you log into a command line, you get bash, not dash, by default.
Yeah.
But when you run a shell script that didn't explicitly specify # exclamation point bin sh at the top, you get a shell that goes out of its way not to implement anything not mentioned by POSIX, which POSIX is one of the core Unix standards, and it's one of the better ones because it A good standard will document, not legislate. It will describe what people are doing and why, without saying, and we think that in the future they should do this even though nobody does now. So POSIX is good that it documented the common subset of what Solaris and AIX and Linux and so on were doing, but anywhere there was controversy, anywhere that two of them disagreed, they tended to just shy away from that and not document that at all, which is why POSIX doesn't specify a mount command. It doesn't specify an init command. You can't boot a system that is only POSIX. So Dash refusing to implement any of the bash features that weren't in POSIX is a bit of a problem to me. I think that it was a bad technical call, and I'm not going with that. I am researching bash to try to figure out what features people actually use to write a proper bash replacement. And since Android is already using MKSH, until I can do something better than that, I have a problem. I'm jumping from topic to topic, sorry. Occupational hazard around here.
Not a problem.
If I put something half finished in toybox, Android has a tendency to go, oh, that looks interesting, and start using it. And then when I go to finish it, I have to be careful not to break them. And there's some awkwardness in there. I mean, such problems we should have. It is lovely that they are using it. I am spending like 80% of my toybox development effort molding this into the best system for Android, because there are literally 1 billion users. That is the largest user base there is. Yes, I'm going to outright pander to them. But I have goals that they are not pursuing in the short term, that they're not against, but they're not willing to put any effort into along the way. If it shows up on a silver platter, they might be happy. But until then, they don't want that to get in the way. So I have to kind of navigate to where I want to go. And not starting, I did a little stub shell years ago at the start of this, and I haven't really put any effort into it since, because when I attack that, it's going to eat my life for 6 months, and I want to do it right the first time. So there's a lot of upfront research.
I see, yeah. Lot.
It does limit the usability of Toybox, though, because in order to use a Toybox-based system, you need a shell. And right now, the Toybox shell is crap. But it is definitely bubbling up my to-do list because it is important. Sorry, I did not silence my phone before doing this.
No problem. Well, but what about boot process? Can we use Toybox on the boot process? So I believe not.
Yeah.
I mean, on Linux.
I have 2 sets of commands. I have the, let me silence the phone. I have the commands in pending, and I have everything else. The commands in the pending subdirectory, you know how the Linux kernel has its staging directory of code that's merged into the tree, but if it breaks, you get to keep the pieces? The pending directory in Toybox is my version of that. So anything that's not in pending, I consider ready to use. If it's in pending, I am pleasantly surprised if it compiles. So, you have frozen on the screen. Google Hangouts is being weird. There we go.
Yeah, Google Hangouts. Well, good. The second question I have here, second question, about license. Because it's something that got my attention. For example, the first versions of Toybox from
GPL.
to
GPL v2.
Yeah, 0 to 0 and so far, it's
and now it's zero ClauseBSD.
Yeah,
Zero ClauseBSD is a public domain equivalent license.
Yeah.
I took the OpenBSD suggested template license, which is why I get to call it a BSD license, because it is the license of one of the major BSDs, and I removed half a sentence. It was the half sentence that requires you to copy this specific license text verbatim into all the derived works. Without that, it's just a permissions grant that says you can copy it, modify it, you know, dance with it in the rain, do whatever you want, you know, make souffles out of it, have fun. And there used to be a comma provided you copy this blob of text verbatim around with you. And I just turned the comma into a period. And by doing that, the result is functionally equivalent to placing it in the public domain. Now, just saying that you've placed something into the public domain, there isn't really a legal mechanism for doing that these days. And a lot of lawyers, because of 30 years of a fear, uncertainty, and doubt FUD campaign, a lot of lawyers say, you know, public domain is somehow toxic. Well, the point of the FUD campaign was to convince people that the public domain was toxic because copyright didn't cover binaries until 1983. There was a 1983 legal decision in the United States, Apple versus Franklin, if you want to look it up. Franklin Computer, the people who made the Speak and Spell, did an Apple II clone where they copied Apple's ROMs verbatim. And they said, well, a ROM, a binary, is just a big number, and you can't copyright a number. You know, you can copyright text, but not compiled code. So you could copyright source code, but you couldn't copyright the compiled binary. And this was the state of the law until 1983. And where they screwed up was there were Apple developer signatures and ASCII text in there saying property of Apple computer, and they copied the whole thing verbatim, including the signatures and the property of Apple. And the original court says, yeah, the law says a binary is just a number, you can't copyright it. Yeah, right, cool. But the appeals court said, I don't know where the line is, but Franklin is over it. I am awarding in favor of Apple. They have violated Apple's copyrights. And this decision created the proprietary shrink-wrap software industry. And suddenly you could copyright binaries, and there was this gold rush to make all the money in the world off of shrink-wrapped software for the PC, where, you know, there was a software industry for mainframes and mini computers before, but the PDP-11 was the most popular computer in the world, you know, the most units sold before it was displaced by the Apple II in like 1977. And in its entire history, the PDP-8 was the most popular. There's a PDP-8 FAQ you can Google for. And in its entire history, it sold somewhere in the neighborhood of, I think, 50,000 units. The figure is in that PDP-8 FAQ, whereas the VIC-20 was the first computer to sell 1 million units. The Commodore 64 also sold 1 million units pretty quickly. The Apple II managed it. PCs were in the millions. The previous stuff had been in the tens of thousands. Suddenly there was, you know, if you charge $20 a thing and your entire market is maybe 8,000 people will ever buy this, well, you can support like a guy maybe. But if 1 million people might buy this at $20 a pop, you know, that's, you can have a building, you know? So the industry changed, the law changed, and the biggest competitor was the fact that there was no word for open source or free software back in the 1970s because there was no software that wasn't. You didn't need the adjective because there was no non-free software. And the proprietary gold rush happened, and then people at about the 10-year mark, most people started figuring out maybe this isn't, you know, a panacea. Maybe there should be an alternative to this. The Free Software Foundation in 1983, Richard Stallman immediately said, no, I am going to push back against the changes in my industry. He happened to be right, but it wasn't some visionary thing. He was advocating the glorious utopia of 1975. He was saying we should return to the old ways. And a lot of people have thought he was some sort of visionary for being a stick in the mud and refusing to change. It's like, okay, yeah, he was right, but 30 years later saying we should go back to how it was in the 1970s, that's a much less defensible position in 2017 than it was in 1983. So it's like a, so I've mentioned one of your upcoming questions, which you've so conveniently given me on the side, and I've been trying not to read them because spoilers, but you talk about the computer history stuff. Computer history is a hobby of mine, and it is decades and decades of story. It is very, very easy to get me off on tangents about things because, well, you know, here's what these people did for 10 years and it takes about 15 minutes to explain. But once it's been explained, you understand this whole chunk of the industry. And it's like, tangent, sorry. Feel free to yank me back at any time. I am self-propelling on some of these topics, you know. Also the things like the bash, you know, the bash versus dash rant. If it's something that I care intensely enough about, you know, let me tell you about my character. I will talk your ear off.
I see. Well, but how is that possible? Because once the code is GPL, it will stay GPL, and you are able to switch from.
There's a difference between copyright and licensing. Copyright is legal ownership vested in an individual or an organization. Copyright says you have certain rights to this intellectual property that other people don't have. A license is a permission statement you've granted saying under what conditions other people can make use of your exclusive rights. I own the copyright on the code I wrote. I can put it out under a license that says you have to, you know, you have to make chicken noises and hop on one leg before using it. I don't know if that would be enforceable, but I can put out a permission statement saying you can't, you know, you can't make copies unless you do this. And originally it was, you know, okay, publishers have the right to print books, that's making copies, and then once that you had bought a book, they couldn't stop you from, you know, putting it in a used bookstore because for sale doctrine. Once you'd bought it, you owned it. Well, computers, loading it from the hard drive into memory is technically making a copy, and where's the line of fair use? And during that 1980s proprietary gold rush, the people who were trying to make all the money in the world, especially once the internet happened and Microsoft realized, hey, this is coming for us and it's very, very big. How do we poison it? That, you know, all these proprietary interests were going, no, when you make that copy, it's not fair use. Basically, it's not fair use is the rallying cry of people trying to corner the market and charge you for breathing. You know, have you paid your breathing license today? You know, it's like where, you know, people have to push back in order to prevent their bathrooms from being fenced in and a coin slot being installed. You know, we constantly have to push back. So in the computer world, it's a little vague sometimes, you know, where does first sale doctrine apply? Where does copyright apply and not apply? It's constantly argued, and it fragments between jurisdictions if it never makes it up to the Supreme Court or something. Or, you know, even if it made it up to the US Supreme Court, but Europe decided a different way and various South American countries decided another way, it can be weird. And one of the things about the GPL, well, back when there was the GPL, you know, now the Linux kernel and Samba can't share code even though they implement two ends of the same protocol. There's no such thing as the GPL anymore, which is why I left the GPL. I was an enormous fan of the GPL back before it's like, well, if you want a copyleft license, do you want GPL v2, GPL v3, GPL v2 or later, which means you can't accept code from either source? Do you want CDDL? Do you want Afro GPL? Do you want copyleft dash next? Do you want any of these fragments that it's shattered into and they're all fighting? It's like, no. But yeah, that's why I moved from GPL licensing to public domain. The GPL was a category killer for copyleft. It was the copy, it was synonymous with copyleft, and it acted as a terminal node in a directed graph of license convertibility, where there were a bunch of other licenses that were GPL compatible. And the only thing you had to care about is this license GPL compatible or not? If it's GPL compatible, treat it as GPL. If it's not, then I can't use it and it's excluded, and I'm done. I never have to worry about licenses interacting, because with the GPL they can't. It's binary. It's either this or not. And I know, because of 17 years of essentially Bible study where people got together and asked lawyers, it's like, okay, what do I have to do to comply with the GPL? And we came up with community norms, and there was a certain amount of legal decisions and stuff, and we asked a bunch of lawyers and went, okay, in order to comply with the GPL, I have to do this. And that's all I ever need to know. I don't need to know the ins and outs of copyright law. I don't need to know. I just need to know if it's GPL, do this, and I'm good. And I didn't have to be a lawyer. Programmers trying to be lawyers, which is what happens when we do anything extensive in licensing, to give you an idea of how bad an idea that is and how bad we are at it, think about security code. If you are not a professional cryptographer and you touch OpenSSL, you've just introduced a timing-based side channel attack where people can, point a Yagi antenna at your keyboard and get wireless signals out of it, and suddenly it's no longer a secure thing anymore for reasons that you didn't understand because you're not a professional cryptographer. But the cryptographers drove that point home so hard that they successfully scared away everybody from doing code review on OpenSSL that they had a trivial buffer overflow exploit, and suddenly you have Heartbleed. And it's like, okay, you do need both sets of groups to sign off on it, but they're very, very different skill sets. Think of when user space developers wander into the kernel guys are immediately going to scream and go, "Don't touch anything!" And then when the kernel developers wander into user space, you get the lovely user interface of Git. So, there's massive domain expertise just within programming when you get to a lot of the more advanced stuff. Now imagine what a lawyer who specializes in intellectual property in US jurisdictions thinks about a European insurance lawyer saying anything about, licensing. They'll basically go, it's just like the cryptographer going, please don't touch, please don't touch. You'll break everything you don't understand. There's 35 years of legal decisions that I have memorized that all interlock in these weird things, and it's different in Utah. Just don't. And then imagine what any of them think when you're not even a lawyer and you're telling me what I should do about the race condition that only happens on a three-way SMP system, doesn't happen on two-way, doesn't happen on four-way, and for some reason it's only manifesting on Tuesdays. Right. It's like if your manager comes in and tells you, and here's how you will debug that, it's like, no, just don't. Okay, that's programmers talking about licensing. We mean well, but we suck at it, which is why the GPL was such a marvelous hack, because it meant we didn't have to. And in the absence of that universal receiver, now that it's fragmented into multiple warring camps, a lot of people are kicking up to universal donor. They want to just public domain their code and opt out of licensing. But 30 years of FUD in the public domain means just, saying it's in the public domain. Well, a lot of people won't touch it because that's not a license. And what even more people have done, 80% of the code on GitHub won't specify a license at all. That's not through ignorance. That's Napster-style civil disobedience, where people are going, the law is stupid. If YouTube, somebody on YouTube does a DMCA takedown on my reaction video to a Steven Universe episode, And it's like Steven Universe itself had the character doing a reaction video. That was the creators basically doing a waving at their fans and going, yes, we see what you're doing and we think it's great. And yet there are corporate interests doing takedown notices on a lot of those reaction videos because you can hear the audio of the episode, or they have a tiny version of the episode in one corner so you can, you know, play along. Where mostly what it is someone is going, you know, and here's what I thought when I saw it. It's like, well, if you grew up with the internet and you're watching anime music videos and then one day, you know, one of your favorite anime music videos in your playlist just has a blocked thing, the people who blocked it are old fogies and you're just waiting for them to die of old age so that society can advance. And the 80% of GitHub that is not specifying any license at all for its code, they're trying to opt out of a broken copyright system or a broken intellectual property system where to them, you know, software patents and software copyrights go in the same bucket as too dumb to live. Now, in that context, try explaining to them why GPL v3 is so much better than GPL v2 that you need to go and track down people who did GPL v2 code, and even though that contributor died, you can find their heirs and get them to sign over so that they can move over to the... No, just no. It's not happening. No. No. So I'm actually... The problem is because the public domain was fudded so much, a lot of people are doing public domain adjacent licenses, like, you know, the BSDs, like ISC, like Apache, like MIT. There's a bunch of them. And they all are basically, you know how I took one of them and turned it into a public domain equivalent license by deleting the half sentence that required you to copy this specific license text. And the permissions it granted were essentially, this code is in the public domain except you need to drag along this lump of text. Well, all of the public domain equivalent licenses are more or less, this is in the public domain except, and then they have different phrasing of except. And then you have the problem that, well, I copied code from 3 of these into my project, which license can I use? Each one of them says I need to carry along this ball of text. Well, concatenate them. Toolbox, which is the older Android project that Toybox is replacing, had 33 concatenated copies of the same BSD license. And I asked why. And they said the copyright dates changed. And a strict reading of the license says, copy exactly, so we did. If you ever have to actually, you know, the Kindle Paperwhite had something like 325 pages of license text in its about licensing pull down. If you ever have to go to court and say, oh, I have standing and I'm going to sue you to enforce the license, how? You have, you know, which bits apply to what? If you ever actually try to use it for anything, you have folders and folders and folders, and it's no. But people want public domain-ish, but don't want the public domain, and they wind up with what I refer to as the stuttering problem. And I'm trying to push public domain equivalent licensing because there's 5 or 6 of them out there. There's one called, there's a website called unlicensed.org. There's another one called copyfree. I think it's .net. It might be .org. There's the WTFPL. There's Creative Commons 0. There's a bunch of public domain equivalent license. There's actually a Wikipedia page on public domain equivalent licenses, which I haven't added Toybox to the Toybox license to yet because I don't edit Wikipedia. It's a personal policy of mine. Can of worms, tangent. But the thing about public domain equivalent licenses is if you pull code from 3 different public domain equivalent licensed projects, you can license the result under any of them Or under a completely different license, you can license it GPL if you want to, you know, GPLB4 if it comes out. That's the great thing about the public domain. The actual public domain collapses together the way the GPL used to collapse together, so that you only have to know this one thing and we're good and we don't have to be a lawyer. Public domain is the opposite version of that. It's the mirror image. And the public domain adjacent stuff is not, and people can get gradually turned off by the stuttering problem. You know, when do I have to do it? What do I have to say? Well, if I'm taking a 12-line snippet from this, you know, this thing, it's a small chunk of code, but it's probably covered by copyright. Okay, I need to modify my license to do this, but they have 33 concatenated copies of the license. I have to add 100 times as much license text as I have to add code. They're going to wind up in the Napster-style opt-out camp. That's how that keeps growing, because it's like, I wash my hands of this problem, I'm waiting for the old fogies who cared to die, and then society will advance. And for those of us who are trying to ship stuff in the meantime, I can't use your code. If you don't license it, I can't ship it. I'd love to ship it, but I can't. So.
Yeah.
So that's the whole licensing thing. I'm attempting to promote public domain equivalent licensing, and I came up with one that lawyers actually like, because of the 30-year FUD campaign against the public domain. Lawyers internalized this. It became part of what lawyers tell each other and what they learn as they're growing up. There's something wrong with the public domain. You know, you have to drink the bottled water, you can't drink the tap water because there's something wrong with the tap water and you have to do this instead. And the thing is, the license that I did, ClauseBSD, I actually submitted it to the SPDX license. It's an organization that collects licenses and catalogs them and gives them official names and stuff. I submitted it to SPDX and got it approved there as ClauseBSD with a short identifier 0BSD, you know, rubber stamp from a large bureaucracy, and it's only half a sentence different from an existing BSD license. And because of that, it tends to get corporate rubber stamps, because you can't explain why it's not a good license if this other one that it's almost identical to is a good license. Now, one of the reasons that lawyers hate it, the public domain, is that a lawyer who gives legal advice that permanently costs them a client is going to run out of clients. So if they say, do this thing that means you will never sue to enforce your license again and don't need me in future, that's probably not going to be their first choice. So lawyers tend to like licenses that can be enforced in court. And they may not consciously be thinking of this, but it's part of the gestalt that they pick up. And public domain is a very bad license. If I release my code into the public domain, I can no longer enforce any of my copyrights on it. But BSDI and AT&T sued each other in the late 80s over BSD licensing, and AT&T lost. The BSD license has been enforced in court. Lawyers on both sides got paid. It dragged on for years. This is a great license. You know, so ClauseBSD can get rubber stamped as a BSD license, which it is. That was part of my selection process. What is the minimal change I can make from an existing BSD license? That's why I chose the OpenBSD template license. So, you know, there's that aspect where there's sort of a marketing aspect of being able to call it a BSD license. People recognize that. That was the first category of public domain equivalent licenses, or sorry, public domain adjacent licenses. When the public domain first started being attacked, BSD was the public domain-like license. It predated MIT, it predated ISC. All the others were basically going, well, we don't like your phrasing of this public domain adjacent license, and you require the text to be copied into too many places. So it only needs to be copied into the code. It doesn't need to be copied into the documentation, sort of thing. Yeah. So that's basically what I'm trying to do is zero ClauseBSD, public domain equivalent license, harnessing the name recognition of a public domain adjacent license to get the cloud of people in public domain adjacent licenses actually into the public domain via shoehorn.
I see. Well, that's a curiosity I had, and a mystery for many people. If it was possible to release licenses their projects in another or different license. For example, you did it.
If you own the copyright, and you own all the copyright. Okay, I launched the first GPL enforcement suits that actually went to court. When I inherited BusyBox from Eric Anderson, he had a page called the Hall of Shame that lots of people had reported over the years, you know, this router or whatever has a BusyBox binary in it, but there's no source code and nobody said what version it was built from and whether they patched it and that kind of thing. And that puts them in violation of the GPL. And I said, well, what am I going to do with this page? I don't know. And Eric Anderson's father was a lawyer who could send out cease and desist letters, essentially for free, you know, for his son. But if they didn't respond to the cease and desist letter, he didn't have any follow-up. So the page grew to have, you know, a couple dozen companies listed in it. And I, because of other stuff, I knew Pamela Jones of Grok Law. And I asked her, is there any pro bono legal representation I can get? And she hooked me up with the Software Freedom Law Center. And I dumped this on them and went, can you do something with this? And they went, we'd love to. The Software Freedom Law Center was a pet project Eben Moglen started, a lawyer who was one of the co-authors of the GPL, who made it, you know, be an actual proper license. You know, there was a lawyer involved. And he taught at one of the universities in New York. I keep wanting to say NYU, but it might be CUNY or something like that. He teaches, he's a law professor in New York City. And he wanted to get some of his students real world experience with open source licensing. And here I sent him this large pile of, you know, stuff, and he was just thrilled to go through that and sick his students on it. And after the first year, when, you know, we'd gotten code from lots of different companies that they scraped up what they had and sent it to us. You know, half the time the problem was this came from our upstream vendor like Broadcom or something. We never saw the source code. You know, we don't have it. We can't give it to you. And it's to such an old version that they didn't archive it properly upstream either. As far as we know, this source code no longer exists. You know, how do you support your project? We don't. Oh, we just sell it really cheap, and then there's no security updates. Oh, lovely. Thank you. But when we did get the code, not one line of code was added to BusyBox. It was, they never had anything we wanted. And at the end of a year, I went, shut it down. We're not accomplishing anything. I ran the experiment and proved that there's nothing out there that BusyBox actually wants. And other people got involved who loved using BusyBox as a club to beat companies, you know, over the head with, to try to get kernel source out of them. Not that they wanted the kernel source either. They wanted the specs to the hardware with which to write their own drivers. And in the absence of those specs, they were willing to use that other source to examine it, write a spec, throw the original source out, and then write a new one. You know, even when these companies contributed stuff to the kernel, it would languish for years without being merged because, you know, the kernel guys would look at it and go, that's crap. Here's how you need to completely rewrite it for it to go in. And they went, we don't care. Yeah, so it turned into a big complicated thing. And that was part of, you know, when GPL version 3 came out, I had proved to my own satisfaction that GPL v2, that actually enforcing GPL v2 was a waste of time. And when GPL-v3 came out and did this fragmentation thing, and I got in basically a flame war with the guy who had named the BusyBox project way back in the 1990s, but had almost immediately abandoned it. It had lain fallow for a couple of years before Eric Anderson had picked it up and went, I could use a tool for the embedded space. You know, he was doing some of the first embedded Linux development at Lineo, and his style wasn't to start new projects, but to find something somebody else had done that was abandoned and build on top of it. That's how he also got involved in UC-libc. And, you know, he took that and got a sign-off from this guy who hadn't really done much to begin with and hadn't touched it for years. And he spent 7 years turning it into this big thing. And then I inherited that from him. I had to deal with, oh, we've already merged code from Linux kernel developers that is under GPL-v2 only, because Linus Torvalds posted a statement to the Linux kernel mailing list in 2000, 7 years before this, that all my contributions are GPL-v2 only because I trust the Free Software Foundation about as far as I could comfortably spit out a rat, to quote the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And it was 240 pre-8 or something like that, release notes was words. I have the URL to it. And a lot of the other kernel developers picked this up and went, yeah, that's a good idea. My code's GPL-v2 only too. And some of our tools like the Minix formatter and stuff like that, you know, we'd already merged from the kernel developers, which was probably GPL-v2 only, and then we got a hot plug implementation that had been written by Greg Coe-Hartman that was definitely GPL-v2 only, and I'm going, wait, our project is GPL-v2 or later. That's essentially a dual license. And this code is only under one of those licenses. It can't be under the or later. And I contacted Greg Coe-Hartman and said, can we or later it? And he went, no, you can't. It's v2 only. It's like, oh. So we either don't merge this, or we do merge this and say our project is now GPL-v2 only. We've merged code that's under GPL version 2, and the whole project has to be under GPL version 2. So, okay, we have to drop our dual license. Or it turns out it's worse than that, because we've been merging code from these guys before, and I think we've had GPL-v2 only code leak into our GPL-v2 or later project all this time. And now that GPL-v3 isn't an abstraction anymore, it's actually coming, we may have to care. Oh. So we talked about it on the list for 8 months, on and off, and we eventually came to the conclusion, okay, we're GPL-v2 only. And right after we announced this, Bruce showed up and said, no, I am using my authority as the guy who named this project 10 years ago, even though I've never posted to this list in the history of this mailing list. He didn't say that. And even though my website still says it's on Lineo, even though they went out of business in the .com boom that was 7 years ago, he didn't say that either. I am using my vast powers of being massively out of touch to lecture to you what you will do when GPL-v3 comes out. You will move to it.
Really?
I didn't take that very well. And I talked to Eric Anderson, the maintainer that had handed off to me, and I basically said, you know, hell no. And he went, I don't have a problem with that. And so we locked it down to GPL-v2. And at the end of that, I just didn't want to deal with BusyBox anymore, because this guy who hadn't written anything in, at this point, 20 years, he's not really much of a coder. He's one of the people in Richard Stallman's orbit who is very interested in the freedom aspects of it, and the writing code is a cost of doing business to its, you know, it's like certain kinds of missionaries who are willing to grudgingly feed the poor as long as they can give sermons to them the whole time. Well, it's like, okay, we'll feed the poor a little, but it's mostly about the sermons. And he could take credit for all the work that I had put in on top of the project he had named. I did a forensic analysis to show that none of his code was still in the project and hadn't been for years. Not a line of his code was still in it, but no, he could take credit for everything I was doing. That just took all the fun out of working on BusyBox. And that's why I left the project. I handed off to Dennis Vazenko. I handed off to somebody who, I wanted what was best for the project. And me working on it anymore wasn't that. I didn't want to be a bottleneck. You know? And that's actually how Toybox started, because I had all these ideas left over that it's just, well, I'm just going to keep playing with them off in my corner, and if somebody else wants to pull them into BusyBox, they can. But, you know, the first thing I started with was, I'm going to do a complete rewrite of the base architecture layer so that when you add a new command, it's entirely self-contained in one file. At the time, BusyBox, you had to modify like 5 different files to add a command. You had to change the help text, you had to change the list of available commands, you had to add the command itself, and there were 2 other places you also had to touch, and I don't even remember what they were. But you had to, you know, you had to, adding a command wasn't trivial, and I went, well, I can collate all of this information into one file, and then I can just run sed against it in the build process to generate those other files. And I think this is a cleaner way of doing it. Adding it to the menu config help was one of the others. You know, so, and I did that, and that actually made it hard for the BusyBox guys to suck it in until years later, in like 2010, I met Dennis Vazenko in person finally at the Consumer Electronic Linux Forum that is now called the Embedded Linux Conference. And we sat down at a table in a restaurant, and I just laid out for him. And this is why I made these, you know, I rewrote under this different architecture. And he went, oh, that's a good idea. And he did it his own way, but there are now BusyBox commands where you add one file, and it just auto-detects it's there, and, you know, you run make clean, make def config, and it suddenly the command is there. You know, I haven't had ill will against BusyBox. I haven't, you know, since I left BusyBox, I gave them my patch command from Toybox because they really, really needed it. I wrote a network block device client for them before I wrote it for Toybox. You know, it's like, I am doing Toybox because Android will not take GPL code. You know, BusyBox predates Android by most of a decade, and Android still doesn't ship it. And there were people, no, we'll wait them out. Android will eventually change its thing. No, they have a no GPL in user space policy. GPL v3 came out and shattered the GPL about the same time Android was ready to release its first version, and they were using a lot of GPL software at the time, but they switched to no GPL in user space as their official policy. They said, if you add GPL code to what we ship, other than any of the stuff that's grandfathered in, then you're in violation of the Android trademark licensing guidelines, and you can't call the result Android. And, you know, they use the trademark to enforce that. And this, you know, and since then they've rewritten their Bluetooth daemon to have one under the Apache license. It's like, why did they throw out one that works and write a brand new one? Well, they had some technical reasons, but they also were getting rid of a piece of GPL software. There's a web page out there called Apple's Great GPL Purge that is a list of each version, what GPL packages went away and which ones are left. Apple wrote a new SMB server because they don't want to use Samba since it went to GPL v3. Apple sponsored LLVM. Apple, you know, when GCC went GPL version 3 and Binutils went GPL version 3, they froze on the last GPL v2 versions of each of those packages, and Xcode shipped them for 5 years while they worked on LLVM until it was ready to switch over and become their new compiler. You know, they're not trying to hide what they're doing. They weren't objecting to GPL version 2. They were objecting to GPL version 3. And now that GPL version 3 has come out, it's like remember when the Phantom Menace came out and people, you know, saw it and then started going, maybe Star Wars wasn't such a good movie anymore after all. You know, it's like, well, we used to think this thing was great, but the new thing is so bad it taints the original. And as long as Richard Stallman is still alive, the GPL is not going to have a come to Disney moment like they did, where it's like, it's now been bought by an adult and we're going to fix it all. It's like, it's a thing. I was an enormous fan of the GPL. It took me years to work through. I have to move to public domain now if I want a way forward. I'm going, is there somewhere that we can defend GPL version 2 from GPL version 3? And the answer is no, it's been poisoned by its parents. Our holding action is never going to convince new users to come in. We can keep existing users from defecting, some of them, but the average age of Linux kernel developers is Linus's age, which means the average age of Linux kernel developers is now 46, I think. And in another 5 years, that's going to start becoming a problem. And in another 15 years, it's going to become a big problem. And in another 30 years, we will have moved to something else. I don't know if it'll be a different development. I don't think it can be a different development model for Linux unless they did figure out how to relicense it. And that's a very, very difficult problem because of the way copyright works. What the GPL initially did is they found a hack in the law. It started as the Emacs license and was then genericized because it was a really cool hack. That, you know, it turns copyright back against itself, but what it does is there's two ways of having a work with a lot of different people contributing to its copyright. Different people are different organizations. One of them is called a joint copyright, where everyone owns a share in the copyright, which means any of those owners can issue new licenses to it. So if you had a joint copyright, GPL would be unenforceable because you just need one defector to say, oh, I BSD it. And then suddenly, you know, there's a BSD license on it as well. It's now dual licensed BSD and GPL, which means the GPL, nobody's ever going to bother. The other way is to create a series of derived works. Because when you have a derived work, when somebody takes somebody else's thing and modifies it and puts out their own version, then you have two copyrights layered on top of each other, and you need compatible licenses to both of them in order to use it at all. It's like, you know, if an orchestra plays a copyrighted piece of music, well, the owner of the original, you know, the sheet music can't sell that recording, but the orchestra can't sell that recording without the permit. You know, they both need to agree in order to do that. And this is why nobody ever sells tapes of plays put on in live theaters. It's like, well, couldn't they just sell recordings of it as extra revenue? It's like, you know, especially when they stop doing it. It's like, well, no, because all the various contributors to it, the way that copyright is set up, you would need sign-offs from lots and lots of different, and any one of them saying no, or any one of them holding out for, you know, no, I want $10 million. Everyone else has agreed, but I want half the revenue because I'm the last holdout. It's like, that turns out to be a problem. Well, the way the GPL does it is a sequence of derived works where every patch makes a new derived work, where you have the copyright to your patch, and it has to be compatibly licensed with what went before. And what that means is, in order to relicense something like Linux, you have to track down everyone who's ever contributed to it. You have to audit the code base to see what are all the copyrights on every line, and then either get permission from that contributor to, here's a new license to my copyright, I've granted an additional permission statement, or remove their contribution. And this is an enormous amount of work. I did that work for Toybox. I a half dozen external contributors to Toybox when I relicensed it. I tracked them down, got permission to relicense most of them, and had to remove 2 contributors' work because I couldn't get in touch with them. I just deleted the apps that they had modified, because it's like, I'll write a new one at some point, but right now I want to switch over. But the vast majority of it was still my work. If I were to relicense it today under the same thing, I probably couldn't, because there are too many external contributors. But it is now under a license that's a public domain equivalent license, where the license lets me relicense it, because it doesn't stop me from doing it. It says, do what you want with it, I don't care. And the thing is, this is carefully built expertise over many years, where the end result is the same moral as came out of war games. The only winning move is not to play. I had to go through the exploding tic-tac-toe game in NORAD before it's like, okay, now I know, let's not. So I can tell you a whole lot of weird stuff about copyright and licensing that I painfully learned over a 2-decade period that still doesn't make me a lawyer, that still doesn't give me the full domain expertise of somebody like Eben Moglen. But keep in mind, Eben Moglen and Lawrence Lessig and all these high-power lawyers in the area of not just intellectual property law, not just software license, but open source software licensing, argue all the time. In brief, avoid. Public domain, it's a good thing.
Yeah, I agree. I love the BSD license. At least in user space, I prefer, for example, library in BSD license. I don't know why. Maybe it's cheaper. It's easier to work. To incorporate.
Well, if the stuttering problem doesn't come up, you're home free.
Yeah. Okay, well, maybe the last question, I'm not going to take more of your time here. Just asking about J-Core. It's a new processor coming out
Well, it's
soon,
a new
right?
implementation of an old processor. The Super H processor that was in the Dreamcast and the Sega Saturn and stuff like that, widely used in the Japanese automotive industry. It was one of the big processors in the 90s and early 2000s. And it's a really cool piece of technology. In terms of power consumption to performance ratio, it's one of those ones that's up there with ARM, and it has better code density than ARM. It doesn't have better code density than Thumb, but the ARM developers licensed Super H patents to create the Thumb instruction set. That's how good Super H was at code density, which is really good for embedded systems. But in 1997, there was a thing called the Asian economic crisis, where basically they had their version of our 2008 crash 10 years earlier. Well, it was sort of the savings and loan crisis of 1991, several years later, and it was the same thing as the 2008. The first Bush and Reagan yanked a whole lot of the banking regulation that was put in after the great stock market crash of 1929, that whole Black Friday thing that led to the Great Depression. There was a lot of regulation put in to make sure that it would never happen again. And then the Republicans came in decades later and said, this problem hasn't happened in decades. Clearly it will never happen again. And this is preventing us from strip mining, everybody's parking lot and getting ourselves really, really rich by, we're going to sell your plumbing. It's okay. And they got in power, they yanked the thing, and since then we've had 3 economic crises, the first of which just cost us a lot of money, the second of which caused people to starve to death in Asia, and the third of which we're still trying to dig ourselves out of, and we're coming up on a 4th, because that'll be fun. But anyway, the 1997 Asian economic crisis killed Super H development, because the company that was doing it decided that they didn't want to invest any more money into it. They couldn't afford it anymore. So they spun off their chip design developments in partnership with another company and created Hitachi created a spin-off called Renesas. And Renesas didn't get any of the engineers who had created Super H. They just got the technology. And if you inherit the technology but not the people who did it, you're never going to be able to support it, let alone improve on it. And it turned out Renesas couldn't. So years go by, Super H rolls to a stop because they just couldn't improve it anymore, and they lost interest in trying. They came up with new in-house designs and did a sort of not invented here about Super H, because it's like, well, that's technology we don't really understand. We don't want to push that because we didn't get the guys who did it. And the patents expired. You know, fast forward 20 years from the last time any real investment was put into it, and the last patent on the SH2 processor expired. And Jeff Dione, the founder of the UC Linux project way back in the day, that ported Linux to no MMU systems in the first place, he went, well, you know, in 2003, he went back into hardware development and moved to Japan to be closer to all the hardware fabs and the hardware engineers and stuff, because, you know, Taiwan and stuff is where all these chips come from. And that's why UC Linux rolled to a stop, by the way. He handed it off to other people who didn't maintain it. But, you know, Jeff Dione, very smart guy, went, okay, these patents are expiring. I am going to do a clean room clone of this chip for these products I'm making, which are really cool sensors you retrofit electrical grids with that allow you to use a lot of solar and wind power. Electrical grids were designed with the idea of centralized generation, and then the electricity all goes out in one direction and is consumed at the periphery. And if you start feeding electricity back in from the edges, once you go over about 3% of your total generation capacity, people's light bulbs start exploding and everything goes out of spec, and it's really bad because the grid is blind. It can't see what's coming from where if it's not coming from this one place. And so he's making this stuff called synchrophasers that you retrofit the grid with. So suddenly you can have solar panels on everybody's roof. You can have windmills all over the place. You can have battery packs. You can have demand going, you know, not just all over the place, but actually flowing backwards. And you can work it out because you can see what's happening and you can control the switches to make the grid still function. But it requires lots and lots of investment in retrofitting all this stuff. So he's making the technology to do this. And he could use a processor and run Linux on these systems down under the manhole covers. And so he did a clean room clone of Super H, but he went, I'm not selling processors. I'm selling things that have processors in them. And I wanted a processor with specific characteristics, and this is the one I want. Yay, raw, cool. I've done the work. I'm going to open source it. So he posted the VHDL files under a BSD license. I would still like to convince him to switch it to zero ClauseBSD, but we're talking on and off. But he already kind of made that decision, and I haven't pushed very hard to try to change it because we have many other things to do. But yeah, so Super H, one of the advantages of it is he wanted to run Linux on a system. He looked around for stuff where patents had expired. Well, he looked around for stuff that was really cool technology that did what he wanted. He looked around for stuff where patents had expired so that the existence of the previous chips acts as prior art, and if some patent troll comes around and says, here's a bill for zillions of dollars because we did nothing, he can go, prior art, see you in court, I will hand you your ass. You know, and he's already chased off a couple of, no, it's like, you can't. We have, and they go, oh, you actually did your homework. And but the other thing is, we didn't have to port GCC to it. We didn't have to port, you know, UC libc already supported it. We did have to port muscle libc to it. We didn't have to port the Linux kernel to it. GDB had patches out there to support it. There was already an FDPIC standard for it, which is a binary executable format for no MMU systems. Can of worms. But you know, there was all this existing support that all we had to do was dust it off and maybe forward port it a little, and it just worked. So, you know, we may see this with a couple of other architectures. As they go out of patent, other people may do open hardware versions of them. But, you know, we think J-Core was the best one. We already think we've grabbed the high ground. And x86 switching over to ARM, there used to be the all the worlds of VAX, then all the world was x86, you know, all the worlds of VAX on mini computers. Before that was all the worlds and S360 on mainframes, then all the worlds x86 on PCs, now all the worlds ARM on phones. And it's like, well, if we ever make it to disposable computing, all the world might be a J-core. And the reason we called it J-core rather than calling it Super H is the trademarks didn't expire, so we can't use their name. But it's compatible with the Super H instruction set. That we can say under a trademark variant of fair use.
Cool.
So it's really, really cool stuff. VHDL is a programming language that you compile to hardware. You know, so it's a lot like a software programming language, except every statement executes every clock cycle. You know, and if you can wrap your head around that, it's a programming language, and it's really, really cool. And there's things called FPGAs that used to be hideously expensive and out of the reach of hobbyists. We have loaded this processor into a $49.95 FPGA board that included free shipping from a little company in India, loaded it in there, booted Linux to a shell prompt on it. So the cost of entry is very low. That was as low end as we could fit it in, and it turns out there's not a whole lot of places to go from there. But it turns out that there are a lot of bigger FPGAs that aren't that much more expensive. So we're actually putting together a board called the Turtle board that it's the form factor of a Raspberry Pi 2B, but instead of an ARM chip as its brain, it's got an FPGA as its brain. So you can load J-core into this FPGA compiled with extra circuitry to actually drive the HDMI controller, drive the Ethernet controller, drive all the peripherals that are on a Raspberry Pi 2B. And we used an FPGA that's almost 3 times the size of the other one. So you can do SMP J-core and still have space left over for these extra peripherals. I mean, doing all these peripherals in 2A SMP, there's still some space left in this chip. You know, and we're manufacturing that board ourselves, and we're probably going to do a not GoFundMe, not Kickstarter, because Kickstarter is weird about a Canadian company headquartered in Japan trying to do things. Like Kickstarter it's not entirely US centric, but it's weird enough that we just didn't want to go there because the paperwork was insane. But we're probably going to do some sort of crowdsourcing thing just as a way of doing pre-orders for this. Or we could just manufacture a whole bunch, have them show up and go, hey, who wants to order these? Our biggest problem, we've already done the engineering. We have a dozen prototypes of these lying around. I've got one in a bag over there. It's a really cool thing. It's booted and run Linux. We've gotten a test pattern out on the HDMI. You know, it's really cool. And we don't know how to have a company headquartered in Japan take credit cards from individuals, because the company is selling, you know, we're taking purchase orders from corporations for thousands of units of sensor thing, and when you want to sell to individuals, that turns out to be completely unrelated, and we're working on it. The hardware arrives in May, whether we've made arrangements for pre-orders or not. At that point, we'll just go, maybe we'll take them to conventions and go, hey, anybody want to buy these? You know? Because we want to get them out into the hands of our open source development community as a much better board to do J-core development with. We just haven't figured out how to take anybody's money for them. Because, well, it's on our to-do list. It's not exactly a priority. Well, it hasn't been. Now it's got a deadline attached. We're working on it. It's not my area. I'm a programmer.
Well, but I hope to see it soon, because I love Raspberry Pi, and I saw the Turtle board, and I like it. It's the same as Raspberry Pi.
It's cute, except ours is blue, because blue turtle shells are more powerful.
Yeah, and something I used to say that I was a huge fan of Dreamcast, and I play saying, you all brought my dream back to life. And what dream? My Dreamcast.
It's a cool chip, and QEMU already supported it. The problem we have
Yeah.
with QEMU is our first implementation was SH2 and they support SH4. So they actually support a version with more instructions than ours. And we need a local patch. Well, we don't need it. SH2 code will run just fine on SH4, but it's like running i386 code on an i686. Just because it runs here doesn't prove that it'll run on the real hardware, because you might have leaked in some of the newer instructions you shouldn't be using. So we needed to come up with a patch to QEMU to like, okay, only support the older set of instructions. You know, it's like, well, we haven't really pushed that up into QEMU because it's disgusting and I'm not actually sure it works on current versions. I haven't tried it recently. But the thing is, we intend to do an SH3 version. We intend to do an SH4 version eventually anyway. So if we procrastinate on this to-do item long enough, it does kind of go away. So that's one of those.
Cool.
But yeah, we looked at doing the, our first version was a no MMU version. And we've looked at implementing the MMU that they added in the SH3. And the problem is it's enormous and won't fit in the FPGAs that we're using. It's bigger than the rest of the chip we've done combined. We did a nice, tiny, little, clever implementation. And then this MMU design they have is just awkward. And our current plan is, let's just do a very simple MMU, and it won't be compatible with the previous one, but we can do a tiny Linux patch so that it boots on Linux. And the kernel is, the kernel and the compiler are the only things. Well, no, the kernel will have to care, the compiler will have to care, QEMU will have to care, and GDB might have to care. So we might have to patch several things, but it's not a big patch. As we go forward, we may have a version that diverges from Super H compatibility just because we can do it in like a fifth as much circuitry. We can be so much simpler than they were because we're aiming at different things. And we got some really clever guys, and we actually, one of the nice things about doing Super H is it hadn't been gone so long that the engineers were dead or anything. You know, a lot of them had left Hitachi, a lot of them had like gone into academia, some of them had retired, but Jeff lives in Japan where they lived. He could track them down and talk to them all. And,
Cool.
you know, it was, yeah. A lot of them are happy that, you know, this thing that they worked on for many years, they are happy that we are honoring the spirit of Super H.
Cool.
You know, which we are trying to do.
Okay. Now, just to finish, I just want to ask you one thing.
Mm-hmm.
You said on your blog, you said people not to read your blog, but I do. Sorry for this.
I don't object to people reading my blog. I just don't expect it.
Cool. So I'm going to keep reading it. Well,
I need to catch it up. I have a month and change of blog entries half written that sort of trail off into confusion in the middle of. I write my blog in VI, and then, you know, it's just very simple HTML, and then I rsync it up to the website. And these days I'm like a month ahead in writing than I actually have finished. And I go back and finish some. I put up 3 more today, woo, from back in February that I went through and finished them and make sure my tags close and all that.
Cool. Well, so you said on your blog that you're trying to write a book about computer history. Computer history is a hobby of yours?
I've been meaning to for years. I've been studying computer history for years. The study started very quickly. It turned into, I need to write a book about this because there's just so much material that you've noticed I go off on long historical tangents about where proprietary software actually came from. That should be, you know, 2 pages of book so that I don't keep telling it to people. I can just go, and yeah, that's in a book. I have the to-do list of doom. Yes, I need to write a book on computer history. At some point, I need to take Fabrice Ballard's old tiny C compiler and glue it to QEMU's tiny code generator to produce a tiny little C compiler that supports all the targets QEMU supports. That's a whole project I haven't had time on. My old Aboriginal Linux project is now complete and mothballed, and I am replacing it with a new one called MakeRoot, where I figured out how to do what it does in like 1/10 as much build script. In large part because there's now a toolchain builder that I can rely on that actually provides native compilers, not just cross compilers, muscle cross make. And once I'd factored out the cross compiler and native compiler generation, I'm going, more than half the code went away, and most of what's left is infrastructure that's overkill for what it does. So it's like I need to reboot that project in a new context, which there's code on GitHub, it works, but it doesn't have its own webpage, it doesn't have its own mailing list, it's not complete, it doesn't do everything the old Aboriginal Linux project used to do. Aboriginal Linux was the project that got me into BusyBox development in the first place, because I started, my original idea was Linux from scratch is 110 megabytes, and Knoppix has a budget of 700 megabytes, and the Linux from scratch code is the base layer of it. If I could replace that with BusyBox and UClibc and free up 100 megs for Knoppix, that would do wonders for them. And it quickly turned into, yes, but this smaller base system that can rebuild itself under itself is understandable. Students can learn it. It's auditable. It's it's a security guys. BusyBox ran the big Cheyenne Mountain display at NORAD. I mentioned War Games. That towards the end, before they shut down NORAD, was run by BusyBox. And I found out about this when I was maintaining BusyBox. Someone emailed me and I went, why would you do that? And they went, we have a requirement to audit every line of code that goes into any of these critical defense systems, and would you rather audit 100 million lines of GNU stuff or a few 100,000 lines of BusyBox? And I went, I see your point. And it's like, Android has a similar problem. They're shipping 1 billion with a B, unadministered, POSIX, mostly POSIX compliant Unix systems with broadband connection that no administrator ever logs into. And it's like, that's a terrifying concept. You're familiar with the concept of a Warhol worm? Mm-hmm. Something that infects every potentially infectable system in 15 minutes? Mm-hmm. Introduction to the whole internet in 15 minutes. It's not actually that hard to do if you partition the space you're infecting reasonably. People have been terrified of, Android or iPhone-based Warhol worms. That it's like, I have an Orwellian tracking device that has my GPS coordinates, and it has, it has a speakerphone mode where it can hear everything that's going on in the room. What makes you think that it can't hear that well the rest of the time? It's got a camera in it, it's got all this stuff, and it's like, people do their banking through this thing. So the phones need to be just as audited as all the nuke stuff, because it's like, okay, it may not blow up the world, but it will steal all the world's money. This is a big deal. So that same auditability thing morphed into a much larger project. And I wound up being BusyBox maintainer because while I was trying to replace all the FSF stuff with BusyBox and UClibc, I did so much work on BusyBox that it was more than the existing maintainer, and he basically handed off the project to me and said, here, you're the one who's really driving it these days. So, fun stuff. Yeah. I am keeping someone from their thing. Okay. But I talked your ear off. We didn't get very far through your list, but I sit and type at a computer all day. When that stops, there's sort of a backlog that okay. I will talk your ear off if you're willing to listen. It's a failing of mine.
Okay. Well, it was a real pleasure to receive you here today.
Well, glad you enjoyed it.
Thank you for your time here.
Thank you.
Bye.